The silver fork hit the marble floor with a sound sharper than a gunshot. The conversation in the VIP room died instantly. No one moved, because everyone understood what came next never ended well. Park Seo-ryan didn't look down. He swirled his wine, staring ahead with cold, bored detachment, his posture relaxed in a way that terrified grown men. "Pick it up," he whispered. The command was soft, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Amara Wells stood frozen in her black uniform. She knew exactly what this was. It wasn't about a fork. It was a test, a public execution of her dignity. Amara's jaw tightened, her head lowering not in submission, but in endurance. She sank to her knees. The room held its breath. Onlookers covered their mouths, silent witnesses to her shame. No one intervened. No one ever did. This was how people disappeared in Seoul, by refusing to kneel when a monster demanded it. Somewhere in the room, a smile faded. But as Amara reached for the silver handle, her eyes caught what no one else noticed. A dark, crimson stain was seeping through the pristine white cuff of Seo-ryan's shirt, hidden just beneath his tailored suit jacket. Fresh. Still bleeding. He wasn't just cruel. He was wounded. And wounds meant secrets. Amara picked up the fork. She stood slowly, placing it gently on the table. Then, instead of retreating, she leaned in close, invading his space. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice steady. Seo-ryan's eyes narrowed, his confidence faltering for the first time. "Excuse me?" Her gaze dropped, not to his face, but to his sleeve. "Because you are bleeding, Mr. Park." Seo-ryan went rigid. The room was silent, not because of fear, but because everyone felt it at the same time. The power had just shifted, and the waitress who had been on her knees was now the only person in the room who could decide how this ended. This was the moment she stopped being invisible, and the moment he realized he had made the wrong enemy. "If this found you, tell me where you're watching from. Stay with me. This story is just beginning." Seo-ryan didn't flinch. He didn't look at the cuff, where the blood was beginning to bloom like a dark flower. He simply stared at Amara, his eyes stripping away every layer of her defiance until she felt naked in her uniform. The silence in the VIP room stretched so tight it threatened to snap, broken only by the settling of the silver fork on the table. "Get up," he said. It wasn't a request. Amara rose, her knees aching from the marble floor, but she kept her chin high. She expected him to strike her, to order his men to drag her out. Instead, Seo-ryan buttoned his jacket with a deliberate, agonizing slowness, hiding the stain. He stepped closer, his hand finding the small of her back. To the onlookers, it might have looked like a possessive guidance. To Amara, it felt like the barrel of a gun pressed against her spine. "Walk," he murmured against her ear. "And if you make a sound, the chef dies first." She walked. She moved through the restaurant she had worked in for 6 months, past the faces of colleagues who looked everywhere but at her. Seo-ryan steered her toward the private exit, his grip on her arm iron hard, a stark contrast to his relaxed demeanor. As they passed the security checkpoint, the head guard's hand twitched toward his earpiece, his eyes locking onto Amara with a look of terrifying recognition. The night air was biting, carrying the metallic scent of rain and exhaust. A black sedan waited at the curb, its engine purring with a low, predatory rumble. It wasn't a luxury car. It was a tank disguised as a limousine, the windows tinted so dark they looked like voids. The driver stepped out, opening the rear door without a word, his gaze fixed on a point in the distance, as if witnessing an abduction was beneath his notice. Amara hesitated. The street was empty. If she screamed, who would hear? Seo-ryan didn't give her the chance to decide. He shoved her inside, the force knocking the breath from her lungs. He slid in beside her, and the heavy door slammed shut with a mechanical thud that sealed the world away. The locks engaged instantly, a heavy, hydraulic sound that echoed like a cell door slamming shut. The interior smelled of expensive leather and something sharp, antiseptic. "Drive," Seo-ryan ordered. The car moved seamlessly into the Seoul traffic, a ghost in the machine of the city. Amara pressed herself against the door, putting as much distance between them as the confined space allowed. Sio Ryan didn't look at her. He leaned his head back against the seat, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow and controlled. But his hand was resting on his thigh, inches from hers, and she noticed his fingers were tapping a rhythmic, silent count against the fabric.
He was counting down to something.
The elevator ride was a silent ascent into the clouds, the only sound the rhythmic tapping of Sio Ryan's fingers against his thigh, a countdown that hadn't stopped since the car. When the doors slid open, they stepped into a penthouse that felt less like a home and more like a fortress of glass and steel. The city lights of Seoul sprawled below, indifferent and distant. Sio Ryan stumbled slightly, his hand bracing against a marble pillar, leaving a faint, damp smear of red on the pristine white stone. "Go to the guest room," he ordered, his voice strained but still carrying that edge of absolute command. "Lock the door." Amara didn't move. She watched the way his breathing hitched, the tremor he was fighting to suppress. "If I go into that room, you'll be dead by morning," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. Sio Ryan turned, his eyes narrowing, but the intimidation was dulled by the gray pallor of his skin. He reached for his phone, typing a message with savage intensity, then deleted it entirely without hitting send. "I'm not asking," he rasped. "And I'm not leaving," Amara countered, stepping into his personal space. "You brought me here to silence me. You can't do that if you bleed out on your own floor." She reached out, her hands hovering over his jacket. "Let me see it." For a second, she thought he might strike her. Instead, the fight drained out of him, replaced by a cold, calculating resignation. He nodded once. Amara helped him peel off the ruined suit jacket, the heavy fabric thudding to the floor. When she unbuttoned his shirt, the scent of copper and expensive cologne filled the air. The wound was just below his ribs, a jagged, ugly tear in the flesh that was unmistakably from a bullet. But it was the angle of the entry wound that made Amara's blood run cold. Whoever shot him had been standing right beside him. "This needs stitches," she stated, pressing a cloth napkin from the bar against the flow. "Do you have a kit?" Sio Ryan gestured to a panel in the wall that slid open to reveal medical supplies that looked military-grade. He watched her work, his gaze burning into her as she cleaned the wound with practiced, steady hands. He didn't flinch when the alcohol touched raw nerves, but his eyes tracked her movements with the intensity of a predator studying a new threat. "You're not just a waitress," he murmured, the words slurring slightly. "And you're not just a businessman." Amara deflected, threading a needle. She worked quickly, the silence of the penthouse amplifying the sound of the needle-piercing skin. When she tied the gauze, Sio Ryan gripped her wrist. His skin was burning, but his grip was iron. "No one knows I was hit," he whispered, pulling her closer until she could see the flecks of gold in his dark irises. "If this gets out, the person who did this will finish the job." Amara pulled her hand back, her pulse hammering against his fingertips. "Then you better hope your fiancé doesn't have a key." Sio Ryan's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of genuine shock crossing his face, before he masked it with ice. The morning sun hit the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse with blinding indifference, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the sterile air. Sio Ryan sat on the edge of the leather sofa, buttoning a fresh, white shirt with painstaking slowness. The painkillers Amara had found were dulling the fire in his side to a manageable throb, but his face was still gray, stripped of its usual golden arrogance. "You need to eat," Amara said, her voice low. She placed a glass of water on the table, keeping her distance. The intimacy of stitching him up had evaporated, replaced by the cold reality of their arrangement. "I need," Sio Ryan corrected, his eyes fixed on the elevator doors, "for you to be invisible." Before Amara could ask why, the private elevator chimed, a cheerful, melodic sound that felt like a siren. Sio Ryan's posture changed instantly. The pain vanished from his face, locked away behind a mask of bored indifference. He leaned back, crossing his legs to hide the stiffness in his torso, and picked up a tablet. But Amara saw his hand tighten on the device until his knuckles turned white. The doors slid open. A woman stepped out. She was beautiful in a terrifying, manicured way, wearing a cream suit that looked like it cost more than Amara's entire life. This was the fiancé. She didn't look at the view or the furniture. She looked directly at C. Orion, her eyes scanning him with the precision of a scanner searching for a weapon. "You didn't answer my calls," she said, her voice smooth, like glass sliding over silk. "I was busy," C. Orion replied, not looking up. She walked further into the room, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic tempo on the marble. Amara took a step back, retreating into the shadow of the kitchen island, trying to become part of the architecture. The fiancé stopped in front of C. Orion, tilting her head. She reached out, her hand hovering near his chest, right over the bandage hidden beneath his shirt. C. Orion didn't flinch, but the pulse in his jaw jumped once, visible only to Amara. "Busy," the fiancé repeated, her fingers brushing the lapel of his jacket. She leaned down, inhaling deeply, and her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "You smell like antiseptic, C. Orion." The air in the room vanished. "I cut myself shaving," he lied, his voice bored. He caught her hand before it could press against his ribs and kissed her knuckles, a gesture that looked romantic but was actually a defensive block. She pulled her hand away slowly, her gaze drifting past him to where Amara stood frozen in the shadows. The woman's eyes were dark, intelligent, and devoid of warmth. She didn't ask who Amara was. She didn't need to. She looked at Amara's uniform, then at the glass of water on the table, and finally back to C. Orion. "You have new staff," she noted, her tone suggesting she had found a stain on the carpet. "Temporary," C. Orion said. "Be careful," she whispered, smoothing the front of his shirt with a pressure that made C. Orion stop breathing for a heartbeat. Temporary things have a habit of becoming permanent liabilities. She turned and walked back to the elevator, not looking back, but as the doors closed, Amara saw her pull her phone from her purse and dial a number before the metal slid shut. The scent of the fiancé's perfume lingered in the penthouse like a toxic fog, sweet and suffocating. C. Orion hadn't moved since the elevator doors closed, his gaze fixed on the digital display as the numbers descended. He looked like a statue carved from ice, but Amara saw the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for the water glass. "She knows," Amara said, the silence of the room feeling heavy enough to crush bone. C. Orion didn't look at her. "She suspects," he corrected, his voice a dry rasp. "And suspicion is enough to warrant a cleanup." "I'm leaving," Amara stated, grabbing her purse. "I'm going home before your mess becomes my funeral." C. Orion finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "The moment you step out of this building, you cease to be a guest and become a loose end." Amara ignored him. She hit the call button for the elevator, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The doors slid open instantly, inviting her into the escape she desperately wanted, but C. Orion didn't try to stop her. He didn't call security. He simply watched her go with the grim certainty of a man watching a moth fly toward a flame. The lobby was a cavern of polished stone and hushed conversations. Amara walked quickly, keeping her head down, the urge to run itching beneath her skin. She pushed through the revolving doors into the gray soul afternoon. The city noise washed over her, traffic, sirens, the hum of life. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like exposure. She hailed a taxi, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. Across the street, a man in a gray windbreaker lowered a newspaper. He wasn't looking at the traffic. He was looking directly at her, and he wasn't alone. 2 cars down, a black SUV idled with its engine off, the passenger window cracked just enough to reveal the glint of a camera lens trained on her face. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from an unknown number. "Smile, Miss Wells." Amara froze, her blood turning to ice. The fiancé's threat echoed in her mind. Temporary things have a habit of becoming permanent liabilities. These weren't C. Orion's men. His guards stood closer to the building, rigid and obvious. These watchers were predators in the wild, waiting for the sheep to wander just far enough from the shepherd. She pulled her hand back from the taxi door. The driver honked, impatient, but the sound seemed miles away. If she got in that car, she would never make it to her apartment. She turned slowly, forcing herself to walk back toward the revolving doors, back toward the monster who was currently the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave. As she re-entered the lobby, the concierge picked up the phone, his eyes meeting hers with a look of pity that terrified her more than any threat. The dining room was a theater of shadows and candlelight, set for 12 of the most dangerous people in Seoul. Amara moved around the perimeter like a ghost, her uniform pressed, her face a mask of obedience. Seo Ryan sat at the head of the table, a king holding court while slowly dying on his throne. He laughed at a joke made by a shipping magnate, but Amara saw the way his left hand gripped the armrest, his knuckles white, anchoring himself against the wave of agony rolling through his side. She stepped forward to refill the glasses, the heavy bottle of Bordeaux weighing down her trembling arm.
Don't look at him, she told herself.
Look at the wine. But as she poured for the man on Seo Ryan's right, she caught the metallic scent of copper cutting through the aroma of the vintage red. Seo Ryan's fiancée sat opposite him, her eyes dissecting every movement he made, waiting for a crack in the porcelain. You're quiet tonight, Seo Ryan, the fiancée observed, swirling her wine. Usually you dominate the conversation. I prefer to listen, Seo Ryan replied, his voice smooth, though sweat had begun to bead at his hairline. It's amazing what people reveal when they think no one is paying attention. He took a sip of water, his hand shaking imperceptibly before he set the glass down with a sharp clink that made the guest to his left flinch. Amara moved to refill the fiancé's glass. As she leaned in, the woman's hand shot out, gripping Amara's wrist with bruising force. The table went silent. The fiancée didn't look at Amara. She stared directly at Seo Ryan, a cruel smile playing on her lips. Your staff is trembling, darling. Is the bottle too heavy? Or is the atmosphere in this room making everyone nervous? Seo Ryan's gaze hardened, the gold flecks in his eyes turning to steel. Let her do her job. The fiancé released Amara's wrist with a dismissive flick. Amara retreated to the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched Seo Ryan shift in his chair, a subtle grimace crossing his face as the movement tore at his stitches. Beneath the table, a single drop of something dark landed on his polished shoe. The dinner dragged on for an eternity. Courses were served and cleared. Alliances were tested in coded language. Through it all, Amara watched the stain on Seo Ryan's shirt, the one hidden beneath his jacket, slowly expand, invisible to the guests but screaming to her. He was bleeding through. If he stood up to toast, the game was over. Finally, the guests began to rise. Seo Ryan remained seated, gesturing for them to move to the lounge for cigars. It was a breach of etiquette, a sign of weakness. The fiancée lingered by the door, her gaze dropping to Seo Ryan's midsection, her eyes narrowing with a sudden, dawning realization. She didn't leave with the others. Instead, she turned back, reaching into her purse for her phone. Once the elevator doors sealed the guests away, the facade of the invincible king crumbled. Seo Ryan didn't just sit. He collapsed onto the dining chair, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. The blood had soaked through the bandages, through the shirt, and was now staining the expensive silk of his jacket, a macabre inkblot test spreading across his ribs. Amara moved to help him, but he gripped the table edge, his knuckles white, forcing himself to stay upright by sheer force of will. Clean this up, he wheezed, gesturing vaguely at the wine glasses and the invisible tension lingering in the air. If the morning staff sees blood, I am dead. Amara worked in silence, her hands shaking as she cleared the table, terrifyingly aware that the man guarding her life was currently incapable of standing. She gathered the crystal glasses, the heavy silverware, and the linen napkins. As she reached for the glass where the fiancé had sat, her foot bumped against something hard hidden beneath the velvet chair skirt. It wasn't a shoe, it was a small, matte black burner phone. Its screen cracked as if it had been dropped in a moment of haste or fury. Amara picked it up. It felt heavy, cold, and dangerous in her palm. She shouldn't look. She should hand it to C.O. Ryan and let him handle his own war. But the screen flickered to life in her hand, not locked, displaying a text thread that had been left open. The most recent message, sent only minutes ago during the dinner, read, "He is bleeding. I can smell it." The reply from the unknown number was instantaneous and chilling. "The team is already in the stairwell." Amara's heart stopped. She scrolled up, her fingers trembling, violating the privacy of a woman who would kill her for less. The history went back months. There were coordinates for Manila. There were confirmations of payment. There was a photo of C.O. Ryan taken from a distance, with a red circle drawn around his chest, the exact spot where the bullet had entered. This wasn't just suspicion. It was an assassination order signed in digital ink. She looked across the room at C.O. Ryan. He had closed his eyes, his head lolling back against the chair, defenseless. He believed his enemy was outside the gates, plotting a takeover, unaware that the architect of his demise had been sitting across from him, toasting to his health. Amara gripped the phone, the metal biting into her skin. She had to wake him. She had to tell him. But as she took a step toward him, the digital panel by the front door beeped. A security override code was being entered from the outside. It was a code that only 2 people possessed. The door didn't crash open. It slid back with a smooth, terrifying hiss. The fiancé stepped into the penthouse, not with an army, but with a single man, C.O. Ryan's own head of security, a man named Jean who had sworn a blood oath to protect him. Amara shoved the burner phone into her apron pocket just as Jean locked the door behind them, the metallic click echoing like a gavel sentencing them to death. C.O. Ryan forced himself to sit up straighter, the effort draining the last dregs of color from his face. He didn't look at his fiancée. He looked at Jean. "I didn't realize the price of loyalty had dropped so low," C.O. Ryan murmured, his voice laced with a deadly calm that masked the fact he was moments from passing out. Jean didn't answer, but his hand hovered near his holster, his eyes fixed on a point just above C.O. Ryan's head. The fiancée walked to the table, her heels crunching on a shard of broken glass Amara had missed. She looked at the blood-staining C.O. Ryan's jacket, then at Amara, her expression one of bored distaste. "You're making a mess, darling," she said, placing a folder on the blood-spattered tablecloth. "But it's nothing a signature can't fix." She slid the folder toward him. It was the marriage contract, modified to transfer his assets to her family's control in the event of his incapacity. "Sign it," she commanded softly. "Merge our families tonight. If you do, I call the surgeon waiting in the lobby, and you live to rule another day." Her gaze flicked to Amara, cold and reptilian. "And the girl?" "She simply vanishes. A tragic accident on her way home."
Clean.
Quiet. Amara's hand tightened around the burner phone in her pocket, the evidence that would destroy the woman standing in front of her, if only she could get it to the right people. "And if I refuse?" C.O. Ryan asked, his fingers brushing the edge of the paper. "Then Jean finishes what the bullet started in Manila," she replied with a shrug. "And I tell the board you died a hero defending your estate from an intruder." She smiled at Amara. "We even have the intruder right here." The air in the room grew heavy, the scent of violence overpowering the smell of wine. C.O. Ryan looked at the contract, then at Amara. For a moment, Amara thought he would sign. It was the logical choice, the survival choice. He picked up the fountain pen, the gold nib glinting in the low light, but he didn't uncap it. "I've spent my life building an empire on fear," C.O. Ryan whispered, looking directly at Amara. "But I will not build a future on a lie." He drove the pen into the table, stabbing it through the contract with a violent, final thud. "Kill them both," the fiancé sighed, turning away as Jean drew his weapon. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom didn't open. They remained sealed, guarding the silence of the 12 men and 1 woman waiting inside. C.O. Ryan leaned against the corridor wall, a fresh layer of blood soaking through the temporary bandage Amara had hastily applied. His skin was the color of ash, but his eyes burned with a feverish, terrifying clarity. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, though the tremor in his hand had vanished the moment he checked his weapon. Amara nodded, clutching the burner phone like a grenade. Then let's finish this. He pushed off the wall, signaling to Jean. The head of security, whose betrayal had been a masterful theater to get the fiancé to leave the penthouse, punched the access code. The doors swung open. The fiancée stood at the head of the long obsidian table, her hand resting on the empty chair where C.O. Ryan should have been. She froze mid-sentence, her perfect smile fracturing as the dead man walked in. C.O. Ryan didn't stumble. He walked with the slow, predatory grace of a tiger that knows it is wounded but still lethal. He stopped at the foot of the table, facing her. "You seem surprised," C.O. Ryan said, the silence in the room heavy enough to choke on. "Were you expecting a eulogy?" "I was expecting punctuality," she recovered smoothly, though her eyes darted to Jean, who stood behind C.O. Ryan with his weapon drawn, not on his boss, but on her. C.O. Ryan threw the bloody marriage contract onto the table. It slid across the polished surface, leaving a faint red smear before stopping in front of the board members. "My fiancé believes I am unfit to lead," he announced, his voice gaining strength from the sheer adrenaline of survival. "She claims I am weak. Compromised." He unbuttoned his jacket, letting it fall open to reveal the crimson stains spreading across his shirt. A collective gasp rippled through the room. "She is right," C.O. Ryan admitted, swaying slightly before catching himself. "I was shot. In Manila. By a mercenary paid from an account in this building." "He's delirious," the fiancée snapped, her composure cracking. "He's losing blood. Security, remove him." No one moved. The board members looked from the bleeding king to the woman shouting orders. "Amara," C.O. Ryan said softly. Amara stepped forward. She didn't look like a waitress anymore. She looked like the executioner. She placed the burner phone on the table and pressed play on the audio file she had found, the recording of the fiancé authorizing the payment for the hit. The fiancé's voice, cold and unmistakable, filled the boardroom. "Make sure the bullet hits the lung. I want it slow." The fiancé lunged for the phone, a desperate, feral screech tearing from her throat, but Jean was faster. He caught her wrist, twisting it behind her back until she hit her knees, the exact position C.O. Ryan had forced Amara into only days ago. C.O. Ryan looked down at her, his face devoid of mercy. "You wanted to rule," he whispered, leaning down until he was eye level with her terror. "But you forgot the first rule of this family." He looked up at the board members, his gaze locking onto the man at the far end who had silently reached for his own weapon. "We do not forgive." The skyline of Seoul had not changed, but the woman looking out at it had. Amara stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass of the new headquarters for Park and Wells Global Security, the city lights reflecting in her eyes not as a threat, but as a domain. It had been exactly 365 days since the boardroom purge, a year spent scrubbing blood from ledgers and turning a criminal empire into a fortress of legitimate corporate power. C.O. Ryan stepped up beside her, placing 2 glasses of champagne on the ledge. He didn't startle her anymore. His footsteps were familiar, a rhythm she had learned to read like a second language. "The board is waiting," he said, his voice carrying that familiar, low resonance, but the cold detachment was gone. "Let them wait," Amara replied, turning to face him. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She was dressed in a suit sharp enough to cut, tailored to fit the woman who had stared down a firing squad and won. C.O. Ryan smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened the hard angles of his face. He reached out, straightening the lapel of her jacket, his fingers brushing the scar on her hand where she had grabbed the burner phone that night. "You've grown ruthless, Amara. I had a good teacher." He handed her a glass, but before she took it, his gaze shifted to the entrance of the office, his eyes narrowing with a flash of the old, predatory instinct. A man in a dark coat was lingering by the elevators, watching them with an intensity that didn't belong at a corporate gala. C.O. Ryan's hand drifted toward his hip, a reflex from a life he had supposedly left behind, but Amara placed a hand on his arm. "He's not a hitman, C.O. Ryan. He's the reporter from the Korea Times. We invited him." C.O. Ryan relaxed, though the tension in his shoulders didn't fully dissipate. "Old habits," he murmured, taking a sip of his drink. "They die hard." They keep us alive, she corrected. They walked out to the main floor together, not as master and servant, but as the two most dangerous people in the room. The applause that greeted them was polite, respectful, and underlined with a healthy dose of fear. They moved through the crowd, accepting handshakes and congratulations until they reached the head table for the ceremonial toast. As they sat, C.O. Ryan's elbow knocked a piece of silverware off the table. The silver fork hit the marble floor with a sharp, ringing chime that cut through the conversation. The room went deadly silent. Guests froze, eyes darting between the CEO and his partner, remembering the rumors of how this partnership had truly begun. C.O. Ryan didn't look at the guests. He looked at Amara. For a heartbeat, the memory of that night hung between them, the humiliation, the blood, the kneeling. Then, without breaking eye contact, C.O. Ryan leaned down. He picked up the fork. He wiped it with his napkin and placed it gently on the table, not in front of himself, but in front of her. "My apologies," he whispered, loud enough for the table to hear. "I seem to be clumsy tonight." Amara smiled, leaning in close, reclaiming the space that had once been a weapon against her. "Careful, Mr. Park," she whispered back. "We wouldn't want anyone to think you're losing your grip." He laughed, a sound that signaled to the rest of Seoul that the reign of terror was over, and the reign of the partners had begun. They clinked glasses, the sound ringing out like a final bell. They were free of the shadows, but only because they had learned to become the darkness themselves.